They had been up all night long. But there is nothing to show for the long hours and the hard labor. Again and again, Simon Peter and the others had cast their nets into the seas, and each time they dragged them up, the nets turned out to be empty. They're now exhausted and disappointed, these fishermen, disheartened too. Perhaps that's because this hasn't been the only bad night of fishing. Maybe all of their nights are more like this one than not. Maybe the empty nets are an expression of what Simon Peter's whole life is like. In the Roman Empire, fishing was known to be a miserable job. Biblical historian Ched Myers reminds us that Cicero once referred to fishing and fish selling as two of the most shameful occupations. But fish were important and valuable in the ancient economy, a necessary commodity for feeding millions of people across the empire. Still, there was no such thing as a free enterprise fishing business. Fishing was controlled by the Roman state. And since Caesar owned the lake and all the creatures in it, the catch belonged to him. The biggest and best fish were shipped off to Rome for the tables of the elite. The profit went to the wealthy and powerful. After Rome took its portion, some middling fish might be sold at the local market, but those fish would be heavily taxed in a complicated system of tariffs and tributes. The fisherfolk who actually did the work would see little from their sale. The meager leftovers, if there were any, would feed the fishermen, their families, their neighbors. So in the gospel, when Jesus tells Simon Peter to go back out to try for more fish, you might understand his reluctance in a new way. Why bother? What's the point? In ancient Rome, you did not work for yourself. You worked for Caesar. You lived in a kind of relentless prison. Your whole family worked for Caesar in a massive hierarchy of obligation and subservience and assigned class status. Peter was a peasant at the bottom of a difficult and devastating economy of extraction and abuse. He swam in a sea of injustice. But then, when Jesus also tells Peter to push out into deep water, it's a clue that he has something more in mind than mere fishing. And while Peter is thinking about the fact that this teacher knows nothing about catching fish, Jesus is focused on catching people. This time, when the nets go down, they fill to overflowing. The catch is so large, it's comical. The nets are so full, they're breaking. The fish so plentiful, Jesus has to hail another boat to haul it all in. Can you see it? The slippery, smelly, subversive surprise of that miraculous catch? Peter struggles to drag it all in. He slips and falls over in the boat, and he is completely undone. The whole experience seems to overwhelm him until he flops vulnerably at the feet of Jesus. For a moment, everything stops. But then when Jesus will finally say, "Follow me," you already know Peter is hooked. And when Jesus names their mission, "You will be fishing for people," there is no mistaking that this curious and compelling invitation is about giving up their penchant for the predictable. It's about pushing out into an entirely different life, a deeper life, a far more abundant way of living than the shallow one they and everyone else have been caught up in. The low expectations we've all gotten used to, the assumption that nothing will ever change and that there's nothing we can do about it that will make a difference. Jesus would not let them or us settle for such a small vision. Jesus himself would not linger in that kind of despair, which is remarkable when you consider all that he was up against. Instead, he summons us to follow him and join him in digging deeper, to uncover the hope still swimming out there, to stretch our imaginations, to push out into larger, more expansive possibilities for our lives and for the world, and to cultivate the will and the courage to risk reaching for them. In recent years, again and again, our racial justice ministry has been drawn to the work of Bryan Stevenson. You may remember his book, Just Mercy, and the feature-length movie made from that story he told. You may have heard people in our congregation speak about our sacred and sobering journey last year to Selma and Montgomery, a pilgrimage that took us to sites on the Civil Rights Trail and to the Equal Justice Initiative, the project Stevenson founded. You may have been part of our learning about the deep water work of Bryan Stevenson and his colleagues, not only to represent prison inmates fighting for just treatment under the law and to provide support for their traumatized families, but also to change the criminal justice system, to expose and challenge its racism. This work, remarkably, has also unfolded into a museum and a monument in Montgomery. The Legacy Museum and the National Monument for Peace and Justice, both of which are dedicated to telling the fuller, deeper story about our country's history of slavery, the immense suffering it has caused, and the ways our country is still haunted by it. If we are going to build a different society, Stevenson says, we need to hear the truth and confront our legacy, devastating and difficult as it is, so that we can understand more fully the work we need to do so that our children's children will one day be freed from the burden of racial injustice. This afternoon's event at Mackey Auditorium gives us another opportunity to learn. Anthony Ray Hinton, the NAACP's Freedom Fund speaker, knows about the work of the Equal Justice Initiative up close. It changed his life. Because of the faithful and persistent efforts of EJI, Mr. Hinton was exonerated and freed after nearly 30 years on death row for a crime he did not commit. When Bryan Stevenson speaks about his calling to this work, it sounds to me like a story right out of the Gospels. Bryan was a young law student doing an internship in the Deep South when his assignment one day was to visit an inmate on death row to deliver a message. He was nervous when the condemned man was brought into the room, burdened with chains around his waist, shackles on his ankles, handcuffs on his wrists. When the man was finally unchained enough to sit down, Brian began apologizing. "I'm so sorry," he said. "I am just a law student. I don't know anything about the death penalty. I don't know anything about criminal procedures, appellate procedures, or civil procedure. The only reason I am here is to tell you that you are not at risk of execution anytime in the next year." That's when this man grabbed Brian's hand and demanded, wait, say that again. And Brian reiterated, "You are not at risk of execution anytime in the next year." And then the man said, "Say that again." So again, a third time, "You are not at risk of execution anytime in the next year." That's when the man hugged Brian and said, "Thank you. You are the first person I have met in the 2 years I have been on death row who is not a death row prisoner or a death row guard." And then he said, "Because of you, I am going to see my wife. I am going to see my children. I've been talking to them on the phone, but I haven't let them come and visit me because I was afraid they would show up and I'd have an execution date. I didn't want them to have to deal with that." The two of them kept on talking. They discovered they were the same age and that they had the same birthday, same year, same month, same day. As they became lost in conversation, 1 hour turned into 2 hours and 2 into 3. The appointment was only supposed to last for 1 hour. When the guards came in, they were angry. They took the man, threw him against the wall, wrenched his arms back, slapped the handcuffs on his wrist, wrapped the chain around his waist, locked the shackles at his ankles. Brian begged them to be more gentle. "It's my fault," he said, "not his fault. He didn't do anything wrong." They shoved the man toward the door. But instead of moving, he planted his feet to the floor. And when the guards shoved again, he didn't move. He turned around and said to Brian, "Brian, don't worry about this. You just come back." And then the man closed his eyes and began to sing. It was a hymn from church. "I'm pressing on the upward way. New heights I'm going every day. Still praying as I'm onward bound. Lord, plant my feet on higher ground." For a moment, everything stopped. Even the guards paused and listened before they started pushing him down the hallway. You could hear the chains clanging. You could also hear the singing above the noise, higher ground. Brian says that for the first time, he understood how he could make a difference in someone's quality of life. He knew in that moment he wanted to help condemned people get to higher ground. He also knew that his own journey to higher ground was tied to this man's journey. "If he doesn't get there, I don't get there," Brian said. "When I heard a condemned man sing that song, I understood things about the humanity of all God's children, about all our yearning, all of us, and our desire to be agents of redemption and restoration, of change and freedom." Planting our feet on higher ground. As people of faith, that's our calling too. Drawing near to the immense suffering of the world, becoming proximate, a word Brian Stevenson uses, so that we can see people's needs up close, offer them support and care, and work to change their lives and the systems that condemn them, so that together we can get to higher ground and plant our feet there. Pushing out into deep water, we go there too, moving out of the shallows into the deep, where Jesus takes us to go fishing for people, catching them, grasping onto love for them with one hand, holding on to hope with the other, never giving up on this weary world of ours, because we know that God is in the midst of it, in the muck and in the slippery mess of it, with us, beside us, in us, slowly hauling up the catch, bending the arc toward justice, reaching for the abundance God so wants for us, and holding on to it for dear life. Amen.